Welcome everyone to the Hop Power Hour. And this week we have Trevor Hardy, and he is going to be talking to us about irrigation. He is our irrigation expert. And if everybody's as dry as we are, we definitely need to be thinking about irrigation like 2 months ago. But always good to start talking about it, even if it may be too late. And he's been great helping us set up irrigation systems, explaining irrigation systems, how much to irrigate to many of our growers. So we last minute said, Trevor, can you help us out with an irrigation webinar, because it's so important right now. And he, I'm sure he had, he has a lot going on, but again, he's always willing to help us out. So Trevor, I'm going to let you take it away. Brookdale Farm in Hollister, Vermont, or Hollister, New Hampshire, sorry.
That's okay.
And broadcasting live, right? From.
That's right.
Yeah, Hollister. Okay, so I'm going to mute myself and let you take over the presenting.
All right. We'll see how this works.
Okay, we're here on standby if you need us.
Okay, so hello everybody. What I'm going to try to do here is pop up one of our presentations. What do I do?
Just slide this over so you can see.
Okay. And how do I start the dang thing?
It started, they can see it.
Can everybody see the presentation?
Yes, we can see it. Do you want to put it into
present mode? Yep.
Yep,
I can't
way on the bottom.
Mac. That's what's
okay. Gotcha. It's on
that's why I have my helper here.
Yep.
There we go. Okay. So right now, as Heather was saying, it's really critical to pay attention to your moisture on your hops and stuff. And this is some of the, if you attended the winter meetings, this is a similar presentation to what we're doing. But right now with this season starting off very dry like it was 2 years ago, a lot of us started irrigating in the beginning of May, some in April, depending where you're at, and irrigating all the way through. And right now, where a lot of us are dry, if you got a little bit of this rain, and Heather was just saying they only got 1/10 of an inch up there, a lot of us are actually irrigating in the rain to make sure we get that moisture into the ground, because the ground is so dry and it's not saturated at all that that added moisture that you're getting from the rainfall and while running the drip is helping that spread of your drip to get to all the root zones of your plants. So irrigating in the rain when it's been so dry right now actually is a good thing that a lot of people are doing. So we're going to go through a little bit about this on hops, and you can see here, if you can see my pointer, this is a picture of some irrigation where we just pulled out on some new peach trees, and that's a great depiction of what we call uniformity in irrigation, where those rows are about 400 feet long. And you can see right here on the edge of the picture from our header line where we're feeding out for our drip, we got a nice spread of about 1 foot to 1.5 feet wide of those young trees the day after we put them in the ground. We turn the irrigation on, and that's what you want to see, not little circles right around each tree. That's where the tubing we like to use now, compared to this picture, this tubing has the drippers built into it, so we get an entire root zone wet, where the tubing here and the picture with the dripper hanging on the wire, there's a discrete emitter, and you can see that that's dropping the water right on the hops plants, but in between, there's no water. So when that tube sags or when it drips, the water doesn't go right where you want it to. It's not giving you a nice uniform distribution on the ground because this plant has roots all over the place. So that's just making your water concentrated in one spot, so you're not getting good distribution to the root system, so the plant's not going to grow out and become more vigorous and grab nutrients from different locations. So we're going to jump around a little bit here. Anyway, this is just some history of us. I'm a 7th generation of our fruit and vegetable farm here in Hollis, New Hampshire. We're farming very many acres, both conventional and certified organic. And we have wholesale, retail, pick your own, and my irrigation and row crop supplies company that we run and service everybody in New England, New York, and now pretty much all over the country. And this is just some pictures of our home farm and stuff. When you come to our place, we're right here in the middle where it says 38 Broad Street, across the street from our retail store. And this is just one Google Earth shot of the many different fields we have around the town. Some of our major manufacturers that we represent, big in the name of what we deal with hops, is both Toro and Netafim. They're two of our bigger suppliers that sell us a lot of our drip fittings. Then we use Plant Marvel for the conventional fertilizers, and another one that's a sponsor of this group, even NutraAg, who a lot of folks are using for the OMRI listed organic fertilizers, because they have some new water soluble fertilizers that go excellent through the drip lines, as well as some other manufacturers. So our hop systems are a permanent drip system, which means we set it up and we leave it there for the year, compared to a plastic culture system or something you might see where people are experimenting a lot now in Vermont and some other New England countries, states, is drip tape on things like hemp. But that's an annual crop because you're taking out hops, you're leaving there for the life cycle with the poles and everything is very similar to apples, how it's installed. So we're talking about a permanent system using an orchard tubing. And when we're doing that, our orchard tubing can either be laid directly on the ground, or some people, with how they're doing their crowning and hilling and weed control, some people do hang it on a wire, some people put it on the ground. The preferred method, if possible, with your cultivation practices, is to keep it on the ground because it's a lot more uniform distribution. But if you have to, you can put it on the wire and it'll work as well on the wire. It just, you got to make sure the tubing's really tight so you get uniform distribution of the water. So the reason we like drip is it delivers water directly to the plant right here. It's not watering the weeds or the grass or the waterways or the drive aisles in between the rows of the plant. So the amount of water that we're using is going right to the plant. We're not watering and irrigating non-beneficials to the plant. That also allows us to reduce our water usage. So this season, where we're having a very dry season, I'm sure there's a few people out there that are running low on their water sources if they're using ponds, rivers, or brooks, or maybe their well's a little bit stressed because the water table's so low, that with drip we use only about 1/3 of the water that you would compared to a traditional overhead system per acre. So typically with drip on hops, we're talking 12-foot row centers, you're looking around 25 to 30 gallons a minute of water per acre for drip. On an overhead setting for that, we'd be looking at around 90 gallons a minute per acre. So it's a lot more preferred to use the drip, and it doesn't get the plant wet in the same time. So you don't have to worry about all your different mildews that can happen with these plants. You're keeping the plant dry and you're only wetting the root zone. So the water's going right where you want to use it and you're using less of it. Part of those calculations when you're looking at that is most of your hops are on 12-foot row centers. So if we take a square acre, 208 feet by 208 feet, that's roughly 4,000 feet of row per acre for hops. So when we're looking at that, that's around 36, 38 gallons a minute of water if we have rows that are less than 500 feet long, because we can use a closer spacing on our drip. If they're longer than 500 feet long, we have to use a lower flow dripper or a wider spacing, so it goes down to around 18 or 20 gallons a minute per acre. So some of these components, when you start looking at it, if you have an existing yard or a new yard, is in this picture here. If you can see my mouse, this is an orchard example, but it'd be the same thing for hops. Is we have a water source, which in this case is a well at this little blue circle, and we have a buried main line or a line that's on the surface, and then each of these different fields that are sectioned out are zones that they wish to irrigate at a time. So we run a main line out to those zones. Those zones, then we put a pressure regulator to knock the pressure down to 35 pounds for our orchard tubing, and they can run different zones at a time with their irrigation. All of these systems can be either buried for a header line and sub mains, or they can be run on the surface using a lay flat material. The lay flat material is nice because when the water is not running, you can drive over it with a truck, tractor, sprayer, whatever you want. It's not going to hurt the lay flat at all when the water's not running. When it is running, you know, if you get that emergency thing, you got to drive over it once or twice, isn't going to hurt it. You just want to go straight perpendicular across of it. rather than turning on it or at an angle to reduce any wear or issues that you might have with that lay flat while it's running. And then if you bury it, of course, it's completely out of the way. Or some people like 4-Star and a couple other folks, they actually hang it from their poles. So your header line and everything's suspended up on some of your cables, so you don't have to worry about maintenance and stuff with the lines. And that's a unique situation to hops, as you have very good trellising out there to hold those plants up, so you might as well use the trellis in that case. For our buried lines, if you're burying it in a poly line or a fitting, this is where, depending on your location, some things can be a bit challenging or not. Most of the sub-mains that we put in is a 2-inch poly pipe header. Depending on your soil conditions, if it's heavy clay, if it's rock, if it's shaly, here in one of our PVC towers, you can see a picture of the dirt in one of my peach orchards where it's rather shaly and stony. There's a lot of little fine square stones. And that can be a problem for a buried main line or a sub-main, because over time as the ground freezes and thaws, those little rocks cut this poly piping and put holes in it over time. So if you have some really stony ground, we typically advise that you bed the pipe with 5 or 6 inches of sand to keep the stones from cutting the pipe. If you have some good soils without a lot of rocks, then you've got nothing to worry about. One of the advantages about putting these header lines in and burying them is they're completely out of the way forever. The only added maintenance item is you have to drain them for the winter, because this isn't something that we typically put in that's at frost-free depth. You're only putting this in 6 or 8 inches in the surface, perpendicular to your rows, and then plugging in your drip fitting to go down the row right into the pipe. That typically gets plugged in at about a 45-degree angle, and then it curls up to the surface nice and easy without kinking, and then you can just pull it out on the ground. The people that are using buried main lines, over the years, there's been a couple changes in fittings. The first fitting we started out, people call this the top hat or the orchard tube starter fitting. This we used to just drill a 3/8 hole and push into the poly pipe. And over 10 or 12 years, the ground freezing and thawing, these could crack right here at the union and break off. Then growers were really frustrated because the first 2 years they didn't have these newer fittings. So you had to actually cut the pipe, put in a coupler, and then drill a new hole and punch in a new fitting. It wasn't very easy to maintain. Now, if you have these old ones, we have 2 newer styles which take bigger grommets. So if you have this old style, you can break it off and then just drill a bigger hole. Go with the second style where the single barb in this case goes into the hole. But first we drill the hole bigger, put this rubber grommet in, and then push the single barb connector in. And if that ever fails or the hole gets too big, you can go to the second one called an expando, which is black, and it has 2 little tabs that push out and lock that fitting into the rubber gasket into the pipe, and you can't even pull it out ever. So those are your buried polyline fittings. Those also work if you do suspend this line from your structure for your trellis. So you can take the 2-inch poly, run it across the header, tie it to one of the cables, and come down with your dripper lines and make that work as well. In the line, we can also get an inline valve to turn things on or off. This is a compression style. We have a twist lock nut style and a barb style that works well. And at the ends, we have figure-8 end caps. There's been a couple instances with hops and some orchard guys that we've had some, because of the layout of their locations, we've had some crazy elevation changes where the header like this is at the bottom of the hill and we're pushing water uphill. Not always the best situation, but sometimes that's the only way you can lay it out. So to aid that, instead of using this figure-8 end cap, I don't have a picture here, but we have an auto flushing valve that also acts as an air vent. So it helps charge the lines faster and gives you more run time with water going to the plants. So for when you're pushing water uphill, an air vent at the end of the orchard tubing is very useful. Temporary hookups. This is how a lot of people are doing things now. These are some fresh new pictures right here from an orchard we just put in this spring. So what we're doing with a temporary hookup is instead of burying a poly pipe and a header, we're actually using a drip fitting from the drip tape world, which is a drip starter with valve. This is that blue guy with the blue handle and the blue nut. And that punches into our oval tubing, which is our header pipe, typically 1.5 or 2 inch, depending upon the size of your yard. And that tubing, when we hook it up on the surface, this requires a pressure regulator setup when you hook it up on the surface. The stuff that's buried does not require a pressure regulator setup because that can take up to 80 or 100 pounds in that heavy wall poly. This thin wall header can only take up to about 40 PSI. And that's not static. That's not 40 PSI with the water shut off. That's 40 PSI with the water running and all your valves already open. So when you use a flat tube and you hook stuff up on the header, you have to always open all the rows and the zones that you want to irrigate first before you turn the water on. You don't want to turn the water on first, then walk out to the field and turn on the rows because the pressure will blow all these little valves out. You always got to have stuff open first before you turn the water on. Now this header, it lies right flat in the ground. You can see in the middle picture here, we have it in some trellised orchards. The grass and the weeds grow right over it. Now we actually have a lot of people that have been using our weed mat material for between the rows to keep weeds out, also using that as a weed barrier around their header pipe. So it makes it a lot easier to identify leaks or issues with fittings throughout multiple seasons where this header here, instead of being grown over with grass, which makes it hard to identify those tiny little pinholes, will be covered with a woven mum fabric or a weed blocker underneath, and you can completely see if there's any leaks or holes. And it makes mowing or harrowing or cultivating between the rows a lot easier as well, because you can see where that header pipe is and not have to worry about hitting it with a piece of equipment that you're operating. So that's how we hook those up on the surface. So when it comes to orchard tubing, there's a lot of different manufacturers out there right now, but we have two that we prefer to use because of the size of their dripper for us in the Northeast. So we typically have some dirty water and some high algae content. So Toro Ag and Netafim, in their two different products. In the Toro product, it's the Blue Line PC, the pressure compensating, which is this dripper fitting right here. And in the Netafim, it's the Uniram product. Both of those have discrete emitter drippers that are built into the tubing that we're pulling out in the field that are greater than 1 inch in length, which means they have the largest surface area for filtration to clean that water before it comes out the dripper. So they're the least likely to clog. There are some cheaper tubings out there that Netafim and Jane offer called DripNet PC and Aqua Gale or Aquaflow or something like that. But their dripper is only about 1/4 of an inch long. So when it's that short, that means the tubing is going to fail in about 5 or 7 years as the dripper gets clogged and you're going to have to replace it. The Netafim stuff and the Toro stuff, we've got some of it out that's over 35 years old, and with that long dripper filter in the flow path of each dripper being over 1 inch long, we haven't had any of them clog. So it's good when you're looking at this long-term investment with hops to put a good drip tubing out there with a good emitter, so it'll be there for the life of the crop. Here there's also a bit of a table depicting plant spacing. That came from an orchard application, but it gives you an idea of how much water you need per acre. On some of the larger projects that we've been working on installing this year, not just with hops, but with fruits and hemp and vegetables and all sorts of things, a common misconception that a lot of people don't understand is it's not only the amount of water that you need per acre. So if we have an acre of hops, it's about 36 gallons a minute, but it's also how much pressure loss you have and how much elevation you have from where your pumping source is to get the water up to that field location. So when we do layouts and try to pick out the tubing and the type of supply hose that you need, each one of those has different friction loss characteristics as a result of how much water flows in a pipe. So we want to make sure that we're within our total range, that everything will operate with elevations and fields and things and drip at the same time. It's all about uniformity and getting the water out there evenly to the plants. If we don't have a good design or we have poor uniformity, what's going to happen is here in one of these pictures, all the water is going to come out closer to where the fitting is plugged into the header pipe, and you're not going to get as much water out at the end. So why is that a concern? Some people think, oh, it's just water. Well, when you got a crop that's very healthy and likes to be fed, like hops, you're also going to use this irrigation system to deliver fertilizers. So a properly designed system is calibrated just like a sprayer, So that way you can then distribute nutrients through your drip system to feed your plants accordingly if the system's designed right. If it's not designed right, you're going to see plants at the beginning of your row that are much taller than plants at the end of your row because you're running out of the ability to push the water uniformly to all the drippers so they can drip at the same rate. One thing with all of our orchard tubings, regardless of manufacturer, is it all has to be filtered. So we make a lot of different filter systems and designs and layouts depending on your application, but most of us in the Northeast are using ponds or rivers or surface bodies of water. In that case, we need to use a disc filter system. I actually had a customer in Vermont who was feeding out of one of the rivers and had some new plantings, and they had some trouble just after some rainstorms or after the neighbor who had a farm above upstream from them moved some animals around, and they noticed an algae bloom in their source. Well, the cows had gotten a little close to the river and some stuff went into the water, and they had an algae bloom, and their filter went from this nice orange piece to a black mucky thing like this, and they were losing pressure every hour and a half. They couldn't understand why. And well, what had happened in that environment, there'd been a change with the animals, and something caused an algae bloom in the soil. So we had to work with the neighbor and figure out what their rotation period was so that we could irrigate when we had the cleanest chance of water without particulate in it. So these disc filters for everything that we need for orchard tubing have to filter down to 100 micron or 150 mesh as to not clog those dripper flow paths that are built into the tubing. Without that filtration, that tubing will only last maybe a year and a half to 2 years before they'll be completely clogged if you try to put in a drip system without a filter. And then there's basically, if you clog the dripper flow path with stuff greater than 100 micron, there's no way to clean it. Less than 100 micron, stuff that can get through your filter, we can wash it out because it's fine enough that it's in the flow path. We can take it out with some organic chemicals such as green cleaner, sanidate, some activated hydrogen peroxide. You can use a fertilizer injector, suck that into the line, and then open up the end caps and just flush the dirt out. But if you do it without a filter, you're getting large particulate in there, and that'll actually block off the orifice on each dripper to allow the water into it, so you can't actually clean it out. So you always have to use a filter. It's typical to see them get this dirty in, say, a 4 to 6 hour flush. But what's nice about a disc filter compared to a sand filter or a screen filter is you can just unscrew them. And if you're back flushing, you're getting more than 15 pounds pressure difference, you need to clean them by hand. They open up like an accordion, and you can just wash them off with a garden hose. And they're scalable for a number of acres that we want to do. A sand filter, the trouble with sand when you're going from surface water, even though they're supposed to be good, but they have trouble, is a sand filter is a big round dome, and it builds this layer of cleaned algae from the pond. And if you don't back flush those frequently, that layer builds up on the surface of the sand filter, and it actually becomes an impermeable layer. And then the only way for you to clean your sand filter and get it to work again is to actually shovel out all the sand and refill it. And when we're talking about sand filters, something that not a lot of people know is they think it's sand, you know, beach sand, or you go to the town shed and fill it up with sand that they give you for the winter. That's not the case. The sand that they use in sand filters is actually engineered to be a certain size. It's very specific, mostly a number 17 or a number 20 to get down to 100 micron, which you have to either buy from us or get it at a pool shop, because it's the same type of sand they use at pool filters. You can't just grab sand from the ground to do it. And if that stuff gets clogged, it's really hard to wash it and clean it. You basically got to dump it out and start over. To change the sand in one 30-inch sand filter, you're looking at anywhere between $800 to $1,200. So it's not very cheap filter to maintain. Or the disc filters, you just blow it off with a garden hose or a pressure washer, you're good to go. So that's a little bit about filters. For those of us that do want to take their tubing and hook it on a wire in your hop yard, there's a couple different ways to do it. We can get the tubing that has the clips pre-built on it, and then you can take a 12 gauge or a 14 gauge high tensile wire, and you can hook it to that tubing. But in this picture here where the blue arrow is on the right, you can see there's a clip way by that apple tree, and it comes in usually 4 foot or 6 foot spacings with the clips, another one up here. you can see that there's over, I'm approximating here, about 2 inches of sag in between each clip on that orchard tubing. So where that's kind of at a disadvantage for us, where we're talking about uniformity, is the water will travel to the lowest point and then drip from there. So wherever you have a sag in the line, that's where your water is going to fall. A lot of us that are hooking them on a wire now are using a thing called an H-curl or a curly Q, which is actually a bit of a slinky. It's like a slinky about 3 inches long, and you'll wind that around the tubing and the wire. And what it is it gives you about 3 inches of contact surface area from the tubing to the wire at every connection point, compared to like a 1/4 inch. So that added surface area keeps a lot more tension of the tubing to the wire, so you can keep it tighter so you don't get sag positions in the middle of your tubing, so your water gets distributed uniformly. So curly Qs or H curls are the way to go. But with irrigation in the hop yard, it's all about the right time and applying it at the right pressure and getting the right amount out there. So earlier in this presentation, I was talking about irrigating in the rain. Well, if, as Heather was saying, if they just got 1/10 of an inch of rain up there the other day, hops like about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of water per week. Very thirsty plants. So in a typical irrigation cycle on hops for about 4 hours, most of the growers are using a 24-inch orchard tubing dripper. You're putting out approximately 7,000 gallons of water per acre in a 4-hour application. An acre-inch of rain that a crop would need to get sufficient water an inch down in the soil is 27,154 gallons. That's a lot of water. We're not looking at applying that amount of water per week for the entire acre. We're just looking at putting it in the root zone where the plants or the hops can pick it up. So when we're looking at doing that, we're looking at maybe applying 1/3 to 2/3 that amount of water to that crop of that 27,154 gallons per week to sustain that crop. And why I say about 1/3 to 2/3 is the other thing that plays into that decision is the weather. So the last month and a half, it's been extremely hot and extremely dry. So our evaporation of water from the soil, our evaporation coefficient has been a little bit higher. So the sun's been taking out more water away because there's just no rain coming and the soil's not saturated. So we're actually irrigating a little bit more to keep soil moisture. And that's how you're kind of look at the scenario without making a decision based on data yet. And that's where a lot of folks this season have been buying soil moisture sensors, which they've been using to determine their irrigation cycle. This is a data-driven approach way at looking at managing your irrigation. So to do this, the new preferred method is using the watermark soil moisture sensors compared to the aerometers. And the difference is these aerometers, they're charged with water. This is something that came out in the 60s and the 70s. And they're charged with water. They build a little vacuum. They get a little pressure sensor in here. And there's a clay tip in the bottom of these. And as soil moisture changes, the pressure in this vessel changes as water either gets extracted out or added back to the clay tip on this soil moisture sensor. These are good sensors. You need 2 per zone to measure actually the depth of soil moisture in your soil profile. But the bad thing about these sensors is when it comes to October, maybe late September up your way in northern Vermont, we have the first frost come down and these things are filled with water, so they'll freeze. And once they freeze, they're done. So it's a lot more efficient to go with the electronic version, which is the watermark sensors. So these are little porous tips that measure electric conductivity from a little reader. So you clip the 2 little leads onto these sensors, and you hit a button and hit read, and it measures everything in kilopascals, the same scale as the aerometers, where 0 is wet and 100 is dry. And these sensors, the watermarks, can stay out there for 5, 10, 20 years, infinitely, basically. And they won't, freezing and thawing won't hurt them. So a little bit about that scale, and we're just using a aerometer dial here, is 0's wet, 100's dry. This scale has different readings for different soil types and then by crop. But the basic way to look at it is You'll never see absolute zero. That's with the sensor sitting in a bucket of water. That's super saturation. All your air, all your minerals, everything else has gone out of your soil. We don't ever want to see that. So wet for most of us is, 15 to 20. If you get heavy clays up there, sometimes you can see it get as low as 10. But most of the time it's 15 or 20. That's wet. And dry, we're starting to get around 40 to 45. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 2 soil moisture sensors, and for hops, I'm having them at different depths, which is going to be about 12 inches and 24 inches. If you got a lighter soil, you want to measure moisture a little bit deeper. If you have a clay soil, you want to go a little bit shallower. You want to go 8 and 16, because you can measure moisture a little different on a clay soil because it has a greater water holding capacity. And you put those 2 sensors in at those different depths, and you go out there in the morning, and you want to read the sensors at the same time every day so you get accurate readings. And say it's 9 o'clock, and my top soil moisture sensor says 38, and my deeper one at 24 inches or 16 inches, depending on soil type, says about top one was 38, bottom one says 28. Say 10 different. That's telling me, okay, I got a little bit of water on the shallow depths, but down lower I have a little bit of a reserve. So I'd take that data and then look at the forecast for the next 2 or 3 days. Say, is it going to be hot and sunny for 3 days? Yes, then I know I'm going to water that day. Is it going to be cloudy and chance of rain for 3 days? Then maybe I'd wait a day and see what would happen the next day. If the lower sensor crept back up, then I could turn the water on and try to get them both down into that 20 range to keep consistent soil moisture. Your top one's always going to dry out faster than your bottom one. That's just because it's closer to the sun and it's getting evaporated more and getting used more. So it's finding that range where you want to keep those sensors saturated and keep everything wet and healthy for a consistent growing media for your plants, is to using that information to make a decision as to when to turn water on or turn water off. And you're going to see that response in your crop too. So it's using that data and making your own decisions as to when you want to turn things on or off. They give you a chart in both of these, which takes the soil moisture, and they give you a graph, so you can graph it every day and see how they creep up or creep down, and then you can write when you irrigated or didn't irrigate, so you can see how fast it turns on or turns off. You can also do it digitally. So with the watermark sensors, they sell a package where we can get a bunch of repeaters, and you got to pay a service fee of like 120 bucks a year, and you can access all this stuff on the internet and even now on your smartphone. So this is, for instance, soil moisture and another overlay graph of temperature at our farm in a block of apples, where starting in April, this was from 2 years ago, you can see we're trying to keep in that green box. That's consistent soil moisture. So it's doing pretty good for a while, got a little wet in some places, and then it got pretty dry. And then right about here was where we ran out of water in that pond in the end of June through July, and then it dropped off. I didn't compile the live data right now for our system today, but that pond's already out of water in our location. So I'm sure the soil moisture up in that apple block is up in the 70 or 80 range of kilopascals, because it's so dry right now. We need to irrigate, and we don't have water down there. But that's how you can start using some of this data with that relative to temperature and other things like rainfall to figure out how much your soil moisture sensors are taking up the moisture readings and adapting to your soil conditions to take in or out that water. So that's like when we were talking at the beginning of this presentation about irrigating in the rain. If you're only getting 1/10 of an inch or 2/10 of an inch of rain, continue your irrigation cycle. 1/10 of an inch or 2/10 of an inch isn't going down very deep in the soil. That's just the top inch or so of the soil that's getting wet. It's keeping the dust down. I don't change any of our irrigation cycles on our farm until we get more than an inch of rain. Anything less than an inch of rain in the course of 3 days, we keep all of our schedules the same. More than an inch of rain in the course of 3 days, then we'll look at prolonging some of our watering cycles and delaying it a little bit. But less than an inch, we just keep everything consistent. There's also some other online tools that you can use to help look at your soil moisture and where you're at, as well as drought monitors. One of the best ones is niwa.cornell.edu. And this little image right here shows all the different weather stations throughout the Northeast region in New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maine, and then the airports. And you can click on any of those that are closer to you. And hops being very similar to apples, you can click on the crops page up top here where it says crop management page and select apples, and it can show you how many gallons deficient you are. It'd be a negative number that you need to replace in terms of water to manage that crop. So in the crop management page, when you select apples, to make it similar to hops, if you're on a 12-foot row center or a 14-foot row center, you can actually type that number into the crop management tool. And you want to do that for the same space that you have your hops at, because the root profiles are very similar in terms of water requirements, so you can get an accurate reading of how deficient you are in water. So this is a fun website. It's free if you want to pay with it, want to play with it. You can pay and get your own weather station to be on it, and then it will record your weather data, but it'll make it visible for everybody else as well. But there's also some pest tools and other things in there that you can play with. But once we get the water all uniform and delivered and we have constant soil saturation, then we can start feeding these plants with fertilizer injectors. You can do it both conventionally and organic. I had a lot of people ask me, is it okay to use fish emulsion in drippers? And it is. You just have to make sure you flush fresh water through it for the last 15 minutes so you don't clog your drippers at all. But to do the right fertilizer injectors, you can either have a water-driven injector called a MASI, which has a wider gallon-a-minute range than a piston, or what you typically see in a greenhouse, a mixed right or a dosatron type injector that works on the water hydraulics, sucking in and pushing the water into the system. Both of these have to get sized for the right flow rate range that we're trying to irrigate in a different hop yard acreage for what we're trying to do. If it's outside of the flow rate range, they're not going to get good distribution of fertilizer out to that field because it can't supply enough fertilizer to feed how much the system wants to use. So you always got to size your injector for the zone that you're trying to irrigate. When you talk about fertilizers that we're using too, some of these New England specific ones where a lot of us are deficient in calcium, magnesium, some other micronutrients, one of the ones that we like the most from Plant Marvel is this Veggie Growth Special. It's a 12-5-19 with a 7% calcium, 1.5% magnesium. That's very good for hops. And then later on, we finish with this K-Mag, which is a 15-5-30, get a little more potassium to finish those cones off right before harvest and get everything in there that you need for the plant. That's what we have on the conventional side. On the organic side, one of our sponsors of this whole group is a company called NutraAg. We distribute some of their products as well. They have a 1201 for their Veggie Growth Starter, and they also have a that's OMRI listed, and an OMRI listed calcium that you can feed into these plants to help grow up the vine. Then to finish, they have a 5020, and you can throw some more calcium or potassium in with those as well. And those are all OMRI listed, and they pass the Vermont OMRI inspection. So that's some other options for you on the organic side other than just fish emulsion. Fish emulsion is good, has a lot of the micronutrients in it. It just stinks to all high heaven, and you get it on you, you're going to smell like fish for a while. So there's some other options out there. Here's the NutraAg stuff. I did put it in there. And they have Keith Farnsworth came up, who's the distributor for NutraAg at your winter meeting, and they have some foliar and some drip vegetative programs that they've got posted here. It's on our website and on NutraAg's website with all these different products to help feed your plants. And this is just, again, one recommendation from a company. You as the grower know your plants and know what they need. So don't just stick with everything. You got to see what works for your situation. Everybody's a little bit different, but it's always worth a try. That's a little bit about the irrigation side of things. One of the particular products, this is that weed mat where we're pulling it across the header on the surface on the things that you hook up your drip with when you're hooking it on the surface, so the weeds don't grow around it, so you can see if you have leaks or not. Some people are using this for the first year or two as a weed barrier, so they don't have to weed as much under their hops plants, and your dripper tubing is underneath it. Some aren't. This is all dependent right now what people would like to do or not like to do, but it's also used in between rows for plastic. The one thing that is a little bit different in irrigation scheme when you're using a weed barrier, especially if it's black. It will actually help hold the moisture in. But you also have to be wary of if you got very shallow rooted plants, like first transplants, you actually need to irrigate more because that heat will actually dry out the soil and raise the temperatures a lot more in the top 2 to 3 inches. So you have to pay a little bit of attention to irrigation a lot sooner in the cycle than you typically do. Same thing with the mum fabric, but the big difference between these two is that my weed mat is permeable with water, meaning the rainwater will go through it. This stuff is more like a woven tarp, so the rain doesn't go through it a little bit, but hardly at all, so you don't get the benefit from your natural rain. So this is a much better product in terms of keeping consistent soil moisture compared to the weed mat, mum fabric. And this is some pictures on some hops and some onions and stuff, how people are using them. This picture here is always unique to me. This grower pulled out their material, put their plants in, put their trellis up, and forgot to pull their tubing out first. So the tubing went up on the top. So they kind of had to then take a hoe or a press and press into this weed mat material to make a trench so that the water would travel into where the plant was. You always want your drip tubing to be under your fabric if you're using a fabric. Anyway, that's a little bit of what I've had for some irrigation stuff. I'm going to figure out how to run this thing here.
Yeah, I think that was great. Thank you so much.
So,
Awesome.
yeah, if you have questions or anything else, one thing, if you can see me, the biggest thing I tried to draw out is make Trevor chicken scratch drawings where right here on this image, this is our hops plants put down with little blue circles. This is what happens when you get with drippers that are put directly above plants. You don't get uniform distribution of the water. When you get the tubing with the drippers built in at set intervals, you're going to get nice uniform distribution where you get that whole wet area rather than circles. And that's, if the biggest thing you take away from this is the right way to irrigate is to strive for uniformity in your fields. Get consistent wet profiles rather than little circles everywhere. So that's what you're looking to do.
Great. So everyone, it's time to get your questions going. You can type those into the Q&A box right now. Thank you, Trevor. That was awesome. And hopefully people have some questions. Right now, I'm going to put up the quick polls. So there's 2 questions. If you could answer the quick polls, that would be great. It helps us gauge if you're learning anything from the webinars. And as always, if you have suggestions, please let us know about topics you'd like to hear about in the future. And we listen, obviously, and then try to bring in speakers that are helpful to everybody. Just a reminder, the UVM Extension Annual Field Day is on Thursday up at Borderview Farm in Alburgh, Vermont. We will have an afternoon session focused on hops and barley. And then Trevor will also be there talking about irrigation more specifically in hemp. But I'm sure if you have questions related to hops, he'll answer whatever questions he gets because he's good like that. So if you need more information about the field day, maybe Susan can type the link to the registration in the chat box. The field day costs $10 for farmers, and it's an all-day event with ice cream and a great barbecue lunch. So it's really a good time. So yeah, please get your questions in the chat box. That would be super. Let's see here. People are still answering. Okay, I'm going to give you a few more seconds for the quick poll. Do we have any questions out there? Okay, there's a bunch of you on listening. So hopefully we have some questions coming in. All right, so one question we have is, do you folks do any consulting to help specify the type of irrigation system that's needed? Or do you have a, it looks like, yeah, go ahead.
So on our website, which I'll type in here, we have an irrigation sizing form, and I do custom layouts and designs for everybody. So I'm a bit of a engineer myself, retired and came back to run the family business. And that's why a lot of folks use us for their irrigation services as being a farmer as well. We know how things go together and how important it is to get uniformity in that field. So in the back of our catalog, which you can get at brookdalefruitfarm.com, and hit on the irrigation page, there's a sizing questionnaire, and my email's plastered all over the place. So if you want, you can just send me an email, and as well, with or without the questionnaire and the address and what you're trying to do, and we can design a system for you. All of our quotes and designs are free, provided you get the product from us in the end. If not, if it's more than 10 acres, we do a $500 minimum design fee, which gets incorporated back to your expenses of materials if you get all the product from us. So that's how we kind of do our designs.
Great. There's another question. Do you know of any water measuring devices that work with weather monitoring stations?
So the watermark soil moisture sensors that we use, that graph and the data, work with our MK3 RainWise weather station that you get from rainwise.net. Those are weather stations. They're actually manufactured in Maine. They're really designed for the Northeast climate to be quite rugged. And the soil moisture sensors plug right into those weather monitoring stations. On some of the smaller yards too, we actually have a new electronic controller for those of you that are looking to do automation from Toro called the Evolution Controller that has a soil moisture sensor built into it, and you can program it to have that sensor turn the water on or off based on what that sensor is reading. So that also prevents you from over irrigating if you have a finite source of water. So rainwise.net is where you can get the MK3 MK3 weather stations, or the Evolution Controller. Is it possible to post the websites of the weather stations? Yes.
Oh, you're seeing all. There you go. Well, yeah, you can post those if you have time, Trevor. That would be great. Or you can just send us a list of them, and we'll send them out to folks as well if you don't have time to do that right now. I'm wondering, is anybody using overhead irrigation? Have you seen any of those systems? I know out west, those are used to keep two-spotted spider mite down a bit, more of a misting system. Have you seen any of that?
Yeah, there's a couple folks that are using overhead and misting and cooling for things in other areas other than hops that I've seen. Not as many with your downy and powdery issues that you have that we're seeing in the Northeast. The micro sprinklers you see out in the Midwest and stuff for spider mites, it's kind of a micro irrigation where they're doing some chemigation through that water as well to help attack the spider mites. But there is some surface or micro irrigation that people are doing. The aluminum pipe and sprinkler days that a lot of us used on strawberries or other crops like that, where you move pipes around and do that type of overhead, it uses so much water and you get so much moisture out there. You're basically just growing weeds as well as your crops. So primarily when you're talking about hops, everybody's thinking drip irrigation.
Great. I was just curious. And I'm not seeing any more questions. If folks have questions, please type them in. Scott, do you have anything that you would like to add before we end the webinar today?
Yeah, I can go over the most recent Go Scout results if there are no more questions about irrigation. Actually, I did have one question for you, Trevor. Other than just praying or whatever else you choose to do in case of an emergency, there are a number of folks this year in particular, but like you mentioned, your main water source dries up. Is there anything that can be done as a backup in those situations?
That's a great question. Actually, there's a couple unique things that some people are doing around here. Trucks that haul pool water and fill people's different pools, or milk trucks or something like that. You can get typically 7,000 gallons or an acre's worth of water for an application. And I've got a couple farms around here where their sources have dried up, and it costs them $300 for a tanker per irrigation cycle to come in. Obviously, that's not ideal, but that's a way to get water in your crop to prevent it from dying. Maple syrup tanks and other storage tanks can work as well. NRCS will help you cost share on looking at wells and other things to get different sources and develop sources if your pond or surface water dries up. But one of the things you got to think about now in planning for the future with existing hop yards or new hop yards is when you have a dry year like this, sometimes a dry year fights the bank account a little bit, but August and September when the ponds are dry are the primary time to expand them. So that's when you should start thinking about getting contracts or getting excavator out there or talking to your wetlands bureau and increasing your storage capacity so you have more water to weather the dry years later in your water source.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Trevor. And the main topic of our July Go Scout was irrigation along with pest management. And we did ask a question about the amount of irrigation folks were targeting, and you know, we just recently had a blog post and we posted a optimum gallons per acre is roughly 14,000 gallons a week. So basically two of the irrigation cycles that you mentioned in yours. Interestingly enough, most of the respondents were only able to irrigate between, you know, up to basically 5,000 gallons per acre per week. So of the folks responding, most are not capable of hitting that target of 14,000 gallons a week. And as a result, most folks are seeing lots of spider mite damage. Most of the respondents are seeing spider mite damage along with some of the drought stress in plants. Some of the other things that folks are seeing out in their hop yards are hopper burn, as you would expect, and Japanese beetle damage this time of year. Folks, it's not uncommon to see Japanese beetle damage in you know, about 300 different crops. Thankfully, hop aphids are basically non-existent this year, so there are some benefits to hot and dry weather. We're seeing lots and lots of ladybugs, as well as other beneficials in our hop yards, so that's some good news, definitely. Also, because of this hot, dry weather, not a lot of insecticide applications, mainly just to manage the little bit of potato leaf hoppers and spider mites out there. And so that's just some of the information that we're getting from our Go Scout that I like to share if we've got some time at the end of these power hours. So thank you for those of you who are responding to those monthly surveys. They're really helpful in guiding the direction that we go with these power hours, but then also other outreach efforts. And as Heather mentioned, if you have ideas for upcoming power hours, please share those with us. There's been a number of suggestions for harvest timing, and actually one of the more recent pieces of our research has been into harvest timing, and so we'll touch on that in future power hours. I do see that there is an additional question for you, Trevor. Is there a benefit to stringing up 2 drip lines per row, spaced about 2 feet apart, to resolve the quote-unquote circling of water wetness?
There can be a benefit to uniform distribution of water if you have 2 lines compared to 1 and you kind of stagger those drippers. Or the other contrary thing to that also depends a little bit on soil type to see how far that water is moving where those drippers are, if you're seeing a lot of pooling. Or the other thing is if it's sandier soil, sometimes you can see that pooling because it's very hard for water to move laterally in sandy soil. So instead of doing 1 irrigation cycle for 4 hours, break it up into 2 2-hour intervals, 1 set in the morning, 1 set in the afternoon, and that'll allow the water in the finer drained soils to spread more laterally instead of applying it all at once.
Wonderful. One other quick question for you. You mentioned the differences between the temporary and permanent systems. Are there any benefits for hop growers to think about those temporary systems, or most, if not all, hop growers doing the permanent?
The temporary hookup's nice because if you're just starting a hop yard, you want to start with an acre or 2 and then, grow into 3 to 5 or 10 or something like that. Hooking it up on the surface for the first couple of years is typically a lot cheaper because you don't need an excavator to dig and bury a main line or put in submains and pipe. And as you're adjusting or changing things on your yard and your layout, anything on the surface is infinitely adjustable. Then you can get used to it and go back and bury it. But we also have a lot of people that are just sticking with leaving it on the surface and not even bother burying tubing anymore. So there's options both ways. It's just on the surface, it's easier to install and easier to manage. The one thing to be cautious of, though, is in the wintertime when you take things up and put them away, you got to cap any open pipes or lay flat or anything so the mice don't get in there. I had a few people do some surface irrigation and start it up in the springtime and push mice nests halfway through their dripper lines, and that can create a real mess. So it's just on the surface, there's a little more maintenance to it, but you can do it. Are there some tax advantages to surface installation of irrigations? I don't know if there's much of a tax advantage. It's your installation advantage is it's a lot cheaper. Depends on how you're costing out your irrigation projects as a resource to your farming activity. But if you want to write more off, the installation of a permanent system can cause you to get that capital write-off a little bit higher because it typically costs about twice as much to put a permanent buried system in compared to putting it on the surface as far as the cost of pipe goes. So that's a little bit on the math there.
Great. Well, I think we're just about out of time, 12:58. People are saying great webinar. Good job, Trevor. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your help and expertise, and looking forward to seeing you on Thursday. And again, Susan Brulette put a link to the field day registration, and I would encourage everybody to come. It's a great day to learn about lots of different topics and a good time to catch up with folks. So with that, we will see you next month. And if you have any suggestions for webinars, put them up or send us an email. Thank you, Trevor, very much.
Nope,
I see the sun shining out your window, so you better get outside.
Yeah, you got to go back to work. And again, if anybody wants to learn more on the irrigation stuff, if you didn't catch it all at the webinar here, I invite anybody anytime, come on down. We can show you how we do everything here on the farm. And you can see all the materials firsthand if you're ever just questioning what you want to use or what it might look like. And that's sometimes the best way to learn. So anytime you want to come down to New Hampshire, come take a look. And we'll be happy to show you around. Thank you.
So good field days too down there.
Yes,
at Brookdale.
good field days.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Great, thank you.
Bye.